Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek, the summer of Trek. This is a BookTube event created by Vin at Revenant Reads. He's assembled a valiant bridge crew of other BookTubers, and we're talking about Star Trek fiction, Star Trek movies, Star Trek TV, all summer long. Mostly the Star Trek books. And with no other stricture than that. We're not starting with, the Roddenberry era and moving on from there. This year, we're just any Star Trek, anything that you want to do. So I have been largely spinning a roulette wheel every night and adding a Star Trek book to my nightly reading. I didn't do that yesterday because Randy Ray, the literate Texan, and I decided to do buddy reads of all four of the Star Trek novels by Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth, starting with The Price of the Phoenix, which is my favorite Star Trek novel. And I reread it anyway, even though I know huge chunks of it from memory. I still reread it anyway for that buddy read, and inevitably, I knew when I was picking a Star Trek book last night, I knew that anything was going to feel downhill after that. Anything was going to feel like a disappointment because I love that book so much. And I thought maybe about giving it a rest. After all, I wouldn't want to make more than 1 or 2 Book Trek videos in the whole course of the summer. That would be, a little drastic. But I couldn't do it. I'm hooked on this stuff. I love Star Trek. I have been reading Star Trek books forever and rereading them forever. So I did pick a book, and I read it. And I admit, I'll spoil this right up front, that it was a bit of a disappointment. I don't think I've ever read it before. But it touches on a whole bunch of things. I love to talk about Star Trek subjects while I'm talking about individual books. I read J.M. Dillard's novelization of Star Trek First Contact. So this is a novelization of a movie. It's from a story by Rick Berman and Brannon Braga and Ronald Moore, and a screenplay by Brannon Braga and Ronald Moore. Brannon Braga and especially Ronald Moore are really talented, experienced storytellers who didn't write this book themselves. Instead, the screenplay was handed to J.M. Dillard, who's written Star Trek books before, and J.M. Dillard got the job of writing this book. And a job is really what it is. There's a kind of a small coterie, relatively small coterie of authors who tend to get these jobs. The movie novelization job. The money will be prompt. There will be no dunning of editors. The work will largely be not your own, but it will be in every bookstore in the world when it comes out. There are pros and cons to doing this sort of thing. I've known a couple of writers who've done this sort of thing. They always have ambivalent long-term memories of it. When you question them about it years later, they always say, I was a crushing deadline, and it was worse than a crushing deadline because it wasn't my own work. But the money was good, and, I got, oh goodness gracious. Oh, that was pretty quick. Oh, she still haven't recovered. We went out earlier today on a fairly long walk in the woods, and when we were coming down from the high meadows, we intersected with a paved promenade, an avenue where people actually were, where it wasn't just us and the coyotes, it was people walking their dogs. And by that point, my little bean was hot. We were both a little warm, but boy, oh boy, does she heat up quick. And we met a woman walking a terrier about her size, and he is 16 years old. It was an honor to face smooch with him, an honor. Frida was when she saw him at first, she was all stiff in her usual, how dare you walk around without my permission kind of way. And she makes this little beehive growl in the back of her throat. It is the least threatening sound in the world. And she's not going to act on it. It's just her way of saying, I've noticed you. She's not going to growl or snap at another dog in a million years. But as we got closer to this dog, and I saw that although he was pretty spry, he was also very old, I summarily told her to shut up. I never do that. I never tell my baby to shut up. She's my princess. She can do whatever she wants, but you don't growl at somebody who's 16 years old. And she saw it right after I did and stopped on her own will anyway. And it was an honor to face smooch with him, but she's a little tired, so she didn't give you the full yoga workout. Anyway, where was I before we started talking about dogs? Oh, right, yes. Movie adaptations, screen adaptations. Of course, Star Trek books had their birth in this very same despised sliver of the fiction writing industry. Star Trek books had their birth in someone adapting something that had already been filmed in a different medium, that had already existed and told its story in a different medium. So that's been in the Star Trek DNA from the beginning. And everything has happened that way with Star Trek. Star Trek is, of course, not a literary phenomenon, despite the fact that we're spending a whole summer talking about it. It's a cinematic phenomenon. So every aspect of Star Trek, until very recently, every aspect of Star Trek has been buried, entombed in fine carved marble of print. Almost all of Star Trek has its original beginnings in pastiche fiction. And that's had its ups and downs. In this one instance, I am not willing to completely blame the authors. Because the authors who get these contracts, sometimes the contracts themselves are merciless. Absolutely merciless. I need 90,000 words by the end of the month. I need you to turn this around. If you do, and it's relatively clean, you'll be on a short list to get the next one. It's a way to make a living as an author. If you don't, well, then you won't be on that short list, and nothing you can do will ever get you on that short list. So I don't fault the authors. There's only so much you can do. There's also, as we've alluded to in earlier Book Trek episodes, there's only so much you're allowed to do either. The story, if you're writing an adaptation of something that's already been filmed, you can't change any of it. You can't make major alterations, maybe a little bit here and there. This is a movie that a lot of you will be familiar with. This is where one part of the Enterprise D's crew faces the Borg, while another part of the Enterprise D's crew is back in time on Earth when Zephram Cochrane is field testing his warp drive for the first time. And that's not the first contact, of course, that's alluded to in the story. The first contact that's alluded to in the story is Earth and Vulcan, which is the very memorable last scene of the movie. Needless to say, when the movie came out and I watched it, I was not yet a Next Generation fan. So a lot of it irritated me. A lot of it irritated me. I didn't like the version of Zephram Cochrane. The version of Zephram Cochrane is retconned. And on top of it being retconned, it was also weird. And I don't know how much of it was James Cromwell, the actor who plays him. I don't know how much of it was just, this is a blank slate character. What would you like to do with it? It's just whether that was the idea of the screenwriters or whether that was James Cromwell's idea. All I wanted to say when I was in the theater is, well, it's obvious that one of the two of you thought that, but this is not a blank slate character. We've already met this character. This character is already Star Trek canon. And as I got blue in the face like an Andorian or a Bolian saying with Star Trek Discovery, you can be as creative as you want, but don't mess around with Star Trek canon. If it's already been filmed by people just as smart and just as talented as you are, you don't have any right to toss it in the garbage. Zephram Cochrane is not from Earth. He's human, but he's not from Earth. But that's all right. We'll let it go. It doesn't matter. It was one of many complaints with the Next Generation, with this movie, First Contact. One of my biggest complaints was the straining, Herculean, hernia-inducing attempt to give Captain Picard a personality, to make him an action hero. I didn't think it worked at all. I've never, every once in a while, in the original run of The Next Generation on TV and in the movie theaters, attempts would be made to do that. I think they always fail. That's just not this character. I didn't understand that for a long time, and so I was impatient with the character, but weird that screenwriters wouldn't understand that. But this movie is memorable for the hijinks in the past. Star Trek time travel stories are always interesting. And also the Borg drama in the present, some of which is fairly well done, and which features Lieutenant Hawk, played by Neil McDonough, who's an arresting screen presence in the movie. It's the closest that Neil McDonough ever came to the stardom that really should have been his. And fans love the character. Fans quickly got word that there was industry scuttlebutt that Lieutenant Hawk was supposed to be gay, the first openly gay character in Star Trek. as opposed to Star Trek Discovery that tells you that all of the canonical Star Trek characters that you have ever seen in any Star Trek incarnation were really gay. And if you don't see that encoded 15 layers deep in their dialogue, it's because you're a bigot. It's actually not true. It's actually not true. 1 out of 10. Okay? But nevertheless, nothing of that came out on the screen. Now, I don't know if that was canceled on the studio level or not, but Lieutenant Hawk is just an ordinary guy. He's very good looking, but he's just an ordinary person in the movie. And he is meant to be, in the Borg storyline of First Contact, he is meant to be a slightly more identifiable barometer of the tragedy of the Borg. They don't just kill you, they make you one of theirs. They're like zombies. He is assimilated. He's not just killed, he's assimilated. And that it's really meant to drive home that reality in a way that Jean-Luc Picard being assimilated did not. Because you kind of knew, in season 3 or whatever that was, that the star of a multi-million-dollar TV show was not going to stay a bad guy for the next few seasons. You knew that it wasn't going to stick with Jean-Luc Picard. We never see any of his detransitioning from being a Borg, but we can assume that it happens. We can assume that it took a long time and a lot of surgical interventions to make him back to normal. Somehow or other, Federation science never managed quite to make it healthy enough to remove all of Annika Hansen's Borg enhancements, including the ones around her orbital socket. Jean-Luc Picard had the exact same augmentations by the Borg, and his removed completely. No trace left. So, but he doesn't really count as an index of losing one of your own to the Borg. So we are given a little bit of Lieutenant Hawk. And I was kind of hoping in this novelization that J.M. Dillard would do a little more with Lieutenant Hawk. She does a little bit more with a couple of the human scientists who are with Zefram Cochrane, but not much. I mean, Lily is the main human character aside from Zefram Cochrane in this movie in the past. We get a little bit more of her, but not much. And nothing to speak of with Lieutenant Hawk. He has been covered all over with fan fiction, but nothing in this book. And I don't know if that was A, that J.M. Dillard was told not to do that, or B, that J.M. Dillard simply had no time to do that. That would require that you would have to work that into the plot. It would require time and drafting and whatnot. Maybe there just wasn't time. Maybe this was an incredibly crushing deadline. But I've read like I said, Star Trek has its DNA in pastiche, in adaptations of other genres and other art forms. I've read a lot. I think I've probably read them all, wherever that's done. Of course, I've read the James Blish novels a million times. I've read Alan Dean Foster's Star Trek log books a million times that adapt the animated series. And the movie versions, the novelizations of every movie. And they vary wildly in quality depending on what you get. If the writer of the book has the freedom to embellish on what's on the screen, then you will get an interesting Star Trek book. Like, for instance, the novelization of Star Trek The Motion Picture, which is by Gene Roddenberry. And if he doesn't have the ability to elaborate on what's on the screen, then nobody does. It's his baby. Or the book can be really good if they get a really good writer just to work with whatever they're given. Like Vonda McIntyre for Star Trek II and Star Trek III. And J.M. Dillard, the things that I've read by this author have been good. So this was not. This was boring. And not only was it boring, but it was completely dependent on the movie. There's very little attempt made here to give context or to explain why there's any drama going on and what's here, because it's kind of assumed on the part of the author that you've seen the movie. So you know. And of course, that is a failure. That regardless of whether or not you're writing a movie adaptation or not, you don't do that. You don't take that for granted. You don't take anything for granted. You write it all out in a really, really energetic way for your readers. If you don't do that, you're not really writing a book. This really isn't a book. It's a screenplay with a few semicolons thrown in. So it's not my Star Trek for last night, it was going to be disappointing anyway, because it was following in the footsteps of The Price of the Phoenix, but this was an extra disappointment. No matter what I read tonight, I am going to avoid another movie adaptation, definitely. In fact, maybe to get the stench of this out of my nostrils for tonight, I will read one little part of Alan Dean Foster's adaptations. His are excellent for the Star Trek logbooks, for the animated show. The animated show was largely execrably terrible. There were only a couple of episodes that weren't. Maybe I'll read one of his and see what he does, and not one of the good episodes. Maybe I'll read one of his adaptations of one of the bad episodes and see what he makes of it. I read all those things years ago, but maybe that would help to. I don't want to hold screen adaptation pastiches against Star Trek, and this has got me wanting to do that. So I'll figure out something. And I'll report back tomorrow when we reconvene for Book Trek. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.